Hello, everyone. It's Pastor Bruce from the Arkport Presbyterian Church in Arkport, New York. And I'm glad you're going to join us for another lesson on biblical archaeology. This week, we are interested in the city or the town or the mountain of Shiloh. In Hebrew, it'd be pronounced Shiloh as opposed to Shiloh. And it's an important city. And it may be one you don't know very much about. And so I would be very happy if you join me as we explore what the Bible has to say and what archaeology has to confirm. With that, I'm going to shrink my inset video window so that we can see the slides in full. As always, you are watching this on YouTube, so if you find a slide that has a lot of words and you want to contemplate it, well, you can always just pause your YouTube video and read all the words that are on the slide. I put them in fairly large font for that very purpose. Our cover screen has a picture of the excavation site and the museum for Shiloh, which is a very active excavation site today in Israel. Well, where is Shiloh? Well, Shiloh is smack dab in the middle of Israel at the time of the conquest, at the time even of the monarchy of David and Solomon. I have it circled in red, and you can see that it is about in the middle from an east-west perspective, and it is about in the middle from a north-south perspective, and there's probably a good reason for it being located exactly where it is. As you can see from the map on the right, what we have is some representation of how the 12 tribes of Israel divided the land that was being given to them by the Lord and conquered through the army of Joshua. And then later on, King David. So what about Shiloh makes it interesting? Well, it's important in terms of the conquest story. Joshua bringing in the Hebrews to the promised land. Shiloh plays an important role. It's important in the time of Judges, roughly 1400 BC to 1050 BC, roughly that. And it's also important in the very early monarchy, the monarchy of King Saul. Now, what you're looking at here is an aerial view of one of its great outer walls. It has a great outer wall that is approximately 16 feet wide. And on either side of that wall where this photo is taken are a number of storage rooms. Those are storage rooms. They're not dwelling places. And they're places in which you would find pots or grain to be stored, that sort of thing, food items stored there along the Great Wall. So what topics are we going to look at today? Well, mostly we're interested in the town of Shiloh and the tabernacle. Why is Shiloh important? It's important in part because the tabernacle, where the worship of God will take place, will reside in Shiloh for most of the time between the conquest and the time that the monarchy is established under Saul. Of course, if the tabernacle is there, the Ark of the Covenant is there. I had a lot of Ark of Covenant slides, but I think we need to remove them because there just isn't time. There's so much to talk about. And some of the characters that you will be familiar with will weave their way in and out of this story. Joshua mostly, Eli the prophet. Actually, I had to pull the slides on Hannah, and we will reference the prophet Samuel. These stories, all these stories are found in the books of Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel. And references to Shiloh are found in Psalms and in Jeremiah. And of course, references to the tabernacle are found throughout the Old and New Testaments. So what about archaeology? I mean, we talk about what about Shiloh? What about archaeology? Well, here are some things that we will learn today. That sometimes the historical story that we find in the Bible is offered only subtle testimony in terms of the archaeological evidence. King Hezekiah was sort of a high watermark of finding all sorts of archaeological evidence and shiny objects and other written testimonies, extra biblical writings. But now that we go further back in time, we are actually going back almost another 700 years from the time of Hezekiah, of King Hezekiah. We have to rely on piecing together much more subtle archaeological clues. We're also going to consider that sometimes what is missing can speak volumes. And we'll also consider how peculiar details, if they're peculiar, they can speak volumes. And while I wanted to talk a lot about archaeological techniques, we'll probably go swiftly through the archaeological slides, the team work slides, just because there are so many slides in this slide deck. We're going to ask ourselves, would we be able to surmise what went on at Shiloh apart from the Bible telling us? If we didn't have the Bible telling us, would we come to the conclusion that the activities that are described in the Bible is what we should believe? We're going to ask, what is missing and what must it mean? What can it mean? You know, sometimes the answer is a must, and sometimes the answer is only a can. And when we talk about the peculiar details, what are some credible hypotheses? And does the Bible offer an answer to these peculiar details? I think those will be fun questions to keep in the back of our mind, and we will answer them at the end of this lesson. Well, let's talk about the conquest story. A lot of slides, a lot of words here, but this is from the book of Joshua. This is the 18th chapter. This is the first 8 verses. You are free to read this in your own Bibles. You're free to pause this screen or this video to read all that you would like to read. But this is the part that I'm going to stress. It's just the upper part. The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting. Now, we're going to find out that the tent of meeting is another word for the tabernacle. It is the tent of meeting God. God is there. It's not a meeting house for people to get together and yak to each other. The tent of meeting is the tent where man meets God and God meets man. So they set up the tent of meeting there in Shiloh. The country was brought under their control. This is part of the conquest story. And there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not received their inheritance. You remember that there are 12 tribes of Israel. The Levites are going to get distributed lands because they have a priestly function throughout the land. And the other 11 tribes are going to get large swaths of land dedicated to them. And what we find is at this stage in our story, 7 of the Israelite tribes have not yet had their land assigned to them. There is a nice story about how some spies were collected, or surveyors were collected from each of the tribes to go out and spot what could be spotted throughout the land, so that the land might be apportioned in a way that could be understood when Joshua would later cast lots. So in this story, we have the campaign of Joshua and their armies. Now we remember that the people of Reuben and Manasseh and half of Gad were allowed to stay on the east side of the Jordan River, but their armies, their fighting men, had to join the rest of the Hebrews as they began their conquest. And as they crossed over the River Jordan and went through Gilgal and Jericho, they mounted at first a southern campaign in which Judah and Benjamin and Simeon got their apportionment of land. But as they went north, they came to Shiloh, and on the right-hand side, you see that I have circled where Shiloh is for us. And that is before they start their northern campaign to provide land for the rest of the tribes of the Hebrews. Well, this is a list of those tribes that had not yet had land. I I said Judah and Simeon and Benjamin, but I guess I was mistaken, because on our list, Benjamin and Simeon and Zebulun and Issachar and Asher and Naphtali and Dan, those are all waiting to have the land apportioned to them. And that is spelled out in Joshua chapters 18 and 19. Now, there were some other cities that were called out. Joshua himself gets an inheritance. Caleb gets an inheritance. There are some cities of refuge, and there are some towns that are given to the Levites, the three sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And they are just towns. They aren't whole tribal areas. And all that's being apportioned from Shiloh. I just point out for the towns of Levi, it's fun to have a little family tree. You see that Levi is up there, one of the sons of Jacob. He has three sons, and all three of his sons are going to be given cities, and his sons and their descendants. And out of the line of Kohath comes Amram and Aaron, the priestly line. But we also know that the sons of Korah, also in red, have an important role in temple worship. We find them written about, and we also find that the sons of Korah are authors of some of the Psalms that we have in our Old Testament Bible. So this is the tree of the priestly lines and how we get back to Levi through Aaron and his descendants. Well, the tabernacle, which is going to be at Shiloh. The tabernacle is the tabernacle that God described to Moses. They built in the desert during their 40 years of wandering. They brought that temple with them, their tabernacle with them. It was portable. The pieces could be pulled down, carried by men, and reestablished at every place that they stopped, so that they would have God's dwelling place, or God's residence, or the place of meeting, in Hebrew called the Mishkan. And we find that today at Timnah Park down in southern Israel, there is a replica of this desert tabernacle. And Timnah is really quite the barren desert. We will one day have a lesson on Timnah. It's a very important city for all sorts of great reasons, and the archaeology is very interesting as well. In the book of Joshua, we have a lot of references to the tabernacle, the Lord's house, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, his sanctuary. And so those are 7 references to the tabernacle that we find in the book of Joshua. So let's talk about Shiloh as an archaeological site. We understand part of its importance in the Bible. It is the place of departure from which the Northern Conquest takes place. They set up for permanency, they set up the place of worship in Shiloh, where the priests will keep the tabernacle and maintain it there, and the Hebrews will migrate for festivals, for the festival seasons, migrate to Shiloh. So hundreds of thousands of Jews perhaps will be coming to this one Tel 3 times a year. And you can imagine that's a lot of people for one little hill. I was going to talk about archaeology, and so I'm going to do it very, very quickly. Archaeology needs a plan, and it's usually done in grids. Oftentimes the grids are 5 meters by 5 meters. Each grid will have a doctor supervisor, someone who is well skilled and well qualified to supervise usually students and volunteers who are doing the dig. And a group of these 5 by 5 grids will have the senior supervisor of the day, so that when something interesting is found, the local doctor supervisor can advise and call in extra help if extra help is needed, so that nothing important is destroyed or disturbed until there is a plan for excavating it. And so plans are important, and they are in grids. And in the old days, the grids might be marked with twine, and in the new era, these grids can be marked by lasers. Of course, there is a team, and you see shovels and pickaxes and buckets to move things around. Of course, when you're dealing with something you found, you'll go smaller. You may work with a trowel. You may work with a brush as you are cleaning off something that is known or suspected to be of real interest. The first thing you do with those buckets of things that are extracted, remember, you pulled out the artifacts that you recognize. What you then pass along are the things you don't recognize, and you sift them. And this is a dry sifting process by which we get rid of what is dirt and find what's left. But as we discussed with Bula and things like that, oftentimes what's left looks a lot like the dirt. And we may not know what it is that we have left. We do a hand inspection. But nowadays we take what's left from dry sifting and we send it over to wet sifting, which by simplistic ways of describing is little more than washing off all the dirt and re-inspecting what you had left. I mean, you sifted out what is truly dirt. You've got rocks and perhaps artifacts mixed in. And based on what we have been discovering in wet sifting, many archaeologists believe we have perhaps over the years been throwing away 50% of the interesting finds. And so there are now plans to go back and reprocess the old archaeological dig sites where we dumped all the things that we thought were not of archaeological interest, go back and re-sift all of that with wet sifting and see how much it is that we might discover that we had previously thrown away. So that's actually very exciting prospects. Of course, most archaeologists want to pursue new digs and new sites. So my guess is this will be an activity for break-in archaeologists to re-sift dump piles. And sometimes the pieces are big, many times the pieces are small, and small pieces need a lot of reassembly. That's all I'm going to say about the archaeologists and the volunteers today. I want to say something about the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, and that neither God nor the Ark, which represents him, is a lucky charm. And the Hebrews would have done well to have thought about that. And the reason it's not a lucky charm is because God will not be obligated by us. We can't just march around with the Ark and pretend that God now will be on our side because we brought him in a box to some scene where we wanted God to operate on our behalf. And we're going to quickly go through a biblical story where that exactly seems to be the attitude that the Hebrews had. It is a story in which we are going to encounter a temporary loss of the ark and a permanent loss of Shiloh as the home of the tabernacle. It is a story that we find in 1 Samuel, and it says, Samuel revealed the word of the Lord to all Israel, and then the Israelites went out to fight the Philistines. So there's going to be a big battle between the Philistines and the Israelites, and it says they camped at Ebenezer. We don't know where Ebenezer really is, but we are confident it is near the historical town of Aphek. And the Philistines camped at Aphek. I'm going down to the bottom of this text in 1 Samuel 4. What is this loud shout in the camp of the Hebrews? The Philistines wondered. And then they realized that the ark of the Lord had arrived at camp. And the Philistines were scared because they thought that gods had come to the camp. You see, while the Philistines were pagans, the Hebrews behaved perhaps in a very similar way. They wanted to be victorious against the Philistines, and so they brought the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle in Shiloh, and they marched it to the battlefield. It says here in this text above that Eli, the high priest, his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there observing what was being done with the Ark of the Covenant as they brought this in to help secure victory against the Philistines. Well, let me just say this, verse 10, the Philistines fought, Israel was defeated. You love the candor of the Bible. I hope you do. I do. Israel was defeated, and they all ran home. You know, what a terrible description in the Bible that the Hebrews have for themselves. The slaughter was great. 30,000 foot soldiers fell in battle. The Ark of God was taken. The Philistines now had the Ark of the Covenant. The Hebrews brought this to help them, but this token was taken by the Philistines. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were killed in battle. Well, on that day, a runner makes his way back to Shiloh, and he wants to tell Eli what's going on. Eli is still, as the high priest, is with the tabernacle. And he's sitting in a chair, and he was worried about the ark, and the man entered the city, and Eli wanted to know what had come of it. And that takes us to our next slide as we continue in 1 Samuel chapter 4. And what does he tell him? He tells him that the ark of God had been captured. And when he mentioned this, that the ark of God had been captured, the Bible tells us Eli fell backward from his chair, and he broke his neck, and he died. That is the story. He could not imagine the Ark of the Covenant being taken. This is such a sacred object. It is where God has chosen to meet his people, and Eli cannot even imagine what it means for the ark to fall into the hands of the Philistines. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and close to giving birth, we see in verse 19. And turns out that when she does give birth, verse 21, she named the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel. And so I put down for us the translation. Eli, his name means my God, and Ichabod means no glory. The focus here on the heart of the Hebrew people who love God is that the ark has fallen into enemy hands. The glory has departed from Israel because the ark of God has been captured. That is Phinehas's widow's understanding. So let's back this up a little bit. Let's follow the white arrows from Shiloh. Shiloh is in your upper right-hand corner. And when the battle is mounting in the area of Ebenezer and Aphek, the Hebrews are happy to bring the Ark of the Covenant out of Shiloh, and they bring it to Ebenezer. There is the Battle of Ebenezer, and it's a terrible defeat for the Israelites. The Ark is not a lucky charm. The Ark falls into the hands of the Philistines, and so begins a 7-month journey as the Philistines are celebrating having the Ark of the Covenant, but it turns out it does not work well. And there are too many biblical stories that we just don't have the time to get into. But let me say that the gods of the Philistines fall down. The statues of the gods of the Philistines fall down before the ark, and bad things are happening to the Philistines, and the ark is kind of being ushered from one major city of Ashdod to another major city of Gath to another of the 5 major cities of the Philistines, Ekron, where they finally decide, we're just going to send it back. This is just too horrible. You know, God is kind of toying and making miserable the life of the Philistines. And so they put the ark on an ox cart and just have it sent unattended by the cattle to bring it back to the Israelites. And it makes its way ever so slowly back to Jerusalem. Sadly, it doesn't seem as if there are a lot of people who are interested in bringing the Ark of the Covenant back home to Jerusalem for worship. In fact, it's not going to happen until David is king. So let's go back to Shiloh in the upper right-hand corner. We have the white line that we studied, but what about the yellow line? Well, we believe, many historians and many archaeologists believe that the Philistines were unsatisfied with the massive victory that they had at Ebenezer, and that they marched onto Shiloh and destroyed it. There is actually nothing in the Bible that says explicitly that this happened, that the Philistines marched on Shiloh and destroyed it. But here is where archaeology and a little sleuth work may help us understand that that is the most likely scenario. Well, here's a nice representation of the Ark of the Covenant. It may have looked quite a bit like this. It was overlaid with gold, and it had the cherubims with their wings facing forward, and that was known as the mercy seat of God. The Ark of the Covenant would be within the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle. Well, here is an interesting newspaper article from 2013. And one of the things that we want to be cognizant of is that this archaeology, much of it is relatively recent. And the article recites for us at the upper portion some of the things that we have already covered in the biblical story, but I include it for its conclusion here. Archaeologists and scholars now have more evidence to back the assumption that after defeating the Israelites at Ebenezer or Eben Chayeza, the Philistines advanced upon Shiloh and sacked it. Well, now we're going to look at what that evidence is, because after all, this is a biblical archaeology lesson. Before we go there, let's look at two texts in the Bible that point to the possibility that Shiloh was actually devastated in battle. It says in Psalm 78 that God abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had set up among men, that God abandoned it. Well, that could mean that it was destroyed, or it might mean something else. In prophet Jeremiah, as he's foretelling of what Babylon is going to do to Jerusalem, God tells him, "Go now to the place in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people." God wanted Jeremiah to know the destruction that he is prepared to allow even in the dwelling place of his name. And when we look at Shiloh, Jeremiah and the Hebrews should understand that God is prepared to let this happen to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is now where the tabernacle is, and God is prepared to let it happen there as well. And the suggestion by suggestion, if God was prepared to have the Babylonians utterly destroy Jerusalem, that he may well have been prepared to have the Philistines utterly destroy Shiloh. Well, Shiloh is that hill that's sort of in the middle. In fact, here it's circled. And there's a possible area of where the tabernacle is located. And we know from the Bible the dimensions of the tabernacle. And we find a nice clearing there that fits almost exactly the dimensions of the tabernacle that's described in the Bible. And you say, well, I got this flat space with a stone border, and I have the dimensions of that, the dimensions of the tabernacle as given in the Bible. That's a very promising coincidence, perhaps. So there's been an excavation that has been going on for many years. And what we have found is that there is a destruction layer throughout Shiloh that dates to about 1050, which coincides very nicely, this destruction layer, with the Battle of Ebenezer. And so this is one piece of evidence that suggests, oh, maybe the Philistines did go from the Battle of Ebenezer to Shiloh and utterly destroyed it with a destruction layer that we find that we date to just about 1050 BC. Well, what have we been finding? And note, I want to put in red that we found this in 2018. A lot of the very interesting archaeology is coming to the foreground in very recent years. We have this story from Exodus, this description of the priestly clothing, and the priestly clothing would have pomegranates of yarn and fabric that would be made in their hems, in which they would then put these gold bells that would ring. And here we found this ceramic pomegranate. Obviously, it's not the cloth that went on the bottom of the hem of the high priest, but the pomegranate is a ritualistic symbol of Yahweh. In Hebrew worship, the pomegranate is used in the tabernacle, it is used in the temple, it is used on the high priest, and the suspicion is that this ceramic pomegranate would be used in some ritualistic sense, perhaps adorning some cord that goes to and from the tabernacle, perhaps some other use. This is what Dr. Scott Stripling, who is the, I believe, the director of excavations at Shiloh. He says, exposing a pomegranate in Shiloh is another proof, that's his word, proof, that Shiloh was a sacred place for the Jewish people in its early days. Pomegranates are not usually found outside of places where Yahweh is worshiped, not even throughout Jerusalem. So we find them in sites where there was worship of Yahweh, but we don't find the pomegranate just hanging out in people's households. We found this other rock that is believed to have been a horn on the altar where sacrifices are burned. This is what Exodus has to say. If you make me an altar of stones, do not build it with hewn stones or by wielding your tool upon them, because that way you will have profaned them. And archaeologists refer to non-hewed altars as earthen altars, even though they're made of rocks. I don't know what the transition was. There are two types of altars that we find in ancient Israel, both hewn and what we would call these earthen altars. And I cannot tell you whether or not this is a rock that is hewn or unhewn. It looks like it could have been at one time chiseled, or maybe it's just a lucky find of a rock that would form a horn. And the horn is a rock that goes at the corner of a square altar. The altar of rocks is built up, it's built in a square. In the corner piece, you'll have this one protrusion that goes up, and each of the corners of the altar have this protrusion that stands up, and the part that stands up is called the horn. And the horn of the altar is important. We find references to it in places in the Bible, and I have one example from 1 Kings 2. When the news reached Joab, who had conspired with Adonijah, though not with Absalom, he fled to the tent of the Lord, the tabernacle, and he took hold of the horns of the altar. And my presumption is he could only take hold of one horn at a time. I believe the size of the altar would not have permitted him to hold more than one horn on the altar. And so this horn was discovered in 2019. I mean, very recent discoveries. My suspicion is that when I someday do my biblical archaeological blog and I revisit Shiloh, there will be just so much more that's being discovered because Scott Strickland and his team are continuing their digs in Israel. There's evidence of a priestly sacrifice system. Now, this is a long text from Leviticus chapter 7, but I call out the in bold and underlined verse 32. You know, in the day, people would bring their animal to be sacrificed, and the animal would be sacrificed by the priest. And part of that is we didn't want anyone but the priest spilling blood. In pagan worship, the blood of the animal is really important. People would drink that blood. They would do things with that blood that were not pleasing to the Lord. And so the Lord instructed that only the priests would be the butchers of these animals. And so they would bring for the sacrifices these animals, and the priest would spill the blood. He would usually separate the fat and burn that as a fat as part of the offering, and the smoke would rise. The priest would be usually responsible for cooking the meat. Some portion of it, depending on the nature of the sacrifice, would be burnt, and the rest would be cooked. But the part that's interesting is you are to give the right thigh of your fellowship offerings to the priests as a contribution. That the priests would get the right side of animals in the animal parts in this sacrificial system, and the rest of the sacrificed animal would be returned to the family offering the sacrifice. If it was one of those sacrifices where the animal wasn't completely consumed in fire, the rest of the meat would be, cooked meat would be returned to the family for them to consume, and they would bring it out of the temple or tabernacle area, and they would eat it with their family away. But some of these offerings, the priests were required to eat inside the tabernacle area or the temple area, and then they would dispose of the bones afterwards. Well, here's the interesting part on the right-hand side. Again, I will call our attention to the kind of the bold text, that what we have found is that not only are the bones that we find in Shiloh kosher, they're kosher animals. They aren't dogs or pigs, but they're the animals that are allowed for sacrifice. They are kosher bones, and there is a prevalence of bones from the right side of the animal. So as the family ate their bones, ate their meat, their bones might be disposed of anywhere. But as the priests ate their meat, that would be collected. Those bones would by natural processes find a place where they would be aggregated and disposed of in a communal way, as opposed to the random way that worshipers would dispose of the bones from their various meals. And so we find kosher animal bones, oftentimes young animals, which sacrifices often favor young animals. There are signs of these butcher marks, and they have an awkward proportion of right side bones to left side bones. And okay, let's just tuck that away in the back of our minds. We've also found Egyptian scarabs there. And I believe we found 6 different scarabs, Egyptian scarabs, so far in Shiloh. Now, a scarab is much like a seal, right? In fact, a scarab is a seal. It's carved in stone or molded from clay. And in Egyptian mythology or Egyptian religion, the scarab is of the shape of a beetle. Because beetles, dung beetles in particular, have religious significance. In part, the dung beetle has a habit of grabbing things, dirt and dung, and making little balls out of it. And there's something there that has captured the Egyptian imagination, and thought that the beetle that made these orbs was doing something sacred. And so the dung beetle has cosmological significance. And these scarabs, or these seals, are beetle-shaped, and then they will have drawings that are unique. Usually not writing, just drawings that are unique. And you can tell whose product this is by the drawing that's on there. Each pharaoh had his own scarab. And so that is very helpful when we look at these seals. When we sort that out, none of these, well, this one is not a pharaoh's seal. And there's some evidence that, well, we find pharaoh's seals in Egypt, in Israel, but this is not a pharaoh's scarab. And because Egyptian scarabs are quite common in Canaan or in Israel, I just want to put this, as I put in the green box, the provenance of a scientific dig is very important to understanding its importance. The fact that an Egyptian scarab was found in Shiloh is nowhere near as interesting as knowing at what layer was it found. Is this found in a layer that predates the monarchy? Is this in the time of Judges? Is this a scarab that dates to the Hebrews bringing scarabs out of Egypt and now living in Shiloh? These are the artifacts that they brought with them as they escaped. Is that what is going on here? And that's why provenance and scientific digs are very important. And just finding eye candy, if you will, in an antiquities store doesn't convey a lot of meaning. Well, pottery was found at Tel Shiloh in the ground. As I said, there were storage rooms everywhere, inside and outside the wall. And there used to be a theory that the jug that you're looking at the right was a Jewish jug, a Hebrew jug, based on the shape and the flare of its top rim, because it was unlike Canaanite and Amorite pottery. So that when one encountered a jug like this, you'd say, that is a Jewish or Hebrew jug. Now, I will say that is in some measure of contention these days. And so it's hard to make the same kinds of conclusions that we used to make. And I'll just say that many things are in contention, including that old reliable about the shape of the jug rim. But I thought it would be interesting, and I suspect you might have thought that this would have to be the case. In all these big jugs that are storage jugs, the rim at the top is almost identical in size. There's kind of like only one size fits all. And it's big enough for a man to get his hand in there with a scoop that he's holding to pull out grain or whatever else is in there, and then put the lid back on. So whatever the shape of the jug, whatever even the shape of the neck, if it's a storage jug, it's going to have an opening that is big enough for you to get your hand and a scoop in. Some of the storage jugs that we found there still had grain in them. There were 20 silos that we found in Shiloh so far. Of the 20 silos, at least one of them still had grain in them. Now, the fact that they had grain in them, you usually don't abandon grain. You probably usually take it with you, but if your city was destroyed in battle, you might be fleeing, and everything that's left behind, including food that you couldn't take because you're running away from an approaching Philistine army, that all gets destroyed. Well, Shiloh has many ages to it, not just the Iron Age that we've been interested in with its destruction layer at about 1050 BC. The coin that you have on your right comes from the Hasmonean uprising, much later than the period that we're interested in. So people came back to Shiloh afterwards. I guess I'd be remiss not to mention that Shiloh used to be a Canaanite and Amorite religious center. It is where they did sacrifices. They were doing very much the same things that the Hebrews were doing at Shiloh. Now, they had abandoned that site before the Hebrews came. The Hebrews did not have to fight for Shiloh, but when they got there, there was a wonderful, thick and tall wall. And so it was just a natural for them to take over this religious center for their very own purposes. What am I going to say? Well, if Shiloh was destroyed in 1050, what about the tabernacle? Well, we don't know much, but we know that the tabernacle shows up in the city of Nob, which is near Jerusalem, but we don't know where that city is. What we do know is that King Saul was so angry with the priests who were practicing there that he destroyed the town of Nob and punished the priests. And then the tabernacle is taken to Gibeon. Now we do know where Gibeon is, and there worship would continue at the tabernacle with a high priest. And even after King Solomon had built his temple, he visits Gibeon, but once the temple worship is consecrated and begins, we no longer hear about the tabernacle. We just don't hear about it. And the last time it's even mentioned is in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. And so that is the end of the tabernacle, but perhaps things like the candelabra are moved from the tabernacle to the temple and so on. Well, we do have some biblical testimony about David going to Nob, the city of Nob. So we do have that testimony. And I think we've said what we needed to say about this visiting place. We do have this biblical story of King David and the town of Nob. It's there in the town of Nob of the tabernacle that David gets to eat the shewbread, the sacred bread, the loaves of bread that are intended only for the priests to eat. They are put apart for God and his workers. But David is hungry, and the priest gives him the shewbread to eat. And that happens in the city of Nob. Okay, so let's just finish up. We said early on we wanted to have these 3 questions. Peculiar details, can speak, we said. And so what do we have? Well, we have only kosher bones found in a land where pig was greatly enjoyed and dog was common. The Canaanites and Amorites, they love to eat pig. How is it that we have only kosher bones? Well, of course, we know Yahweh instructed his people only to eat kosher animals. And although the Hebrew people were not perfect in observing kosher diet, if we're at a religious center where the priests are located, it's easy to imagine that you'll have 100% observation of dietary laws when the priests are the ones who are sacrificing the animals. And so the fact that we find only kosher bones here is something that is really very important to us. Only kosher bones in the strata that relate to Hebrew worship in Shiloh. And this other peculiar point, we find a prevalence of animal bones from the right side of the animals. Well, I'm assuming that these animals are like any other animals, and they have an equal number of left and right bones. But the priestly portion was on the right side of the animal, and so the worshipers ate locally, but they were also free to take their sacrifices with them to eat it elsewhere. But the priests ate locally, and so they probably disposed of their bones locally, and so there's going to be a disproportionate number of right side bones. We said sometimes what is missing can speak volumes. So what's missing? What must it mean, or what might it mean? Well, I didn't show this in my brief, but there are no dwelling places that we have found within the strongly walled city of Shiloh. Think about that. You've got this strongly walled city, 15 feet wide walls, 25 feet high walls, and it's not for people. People aren't living in the city. Well, something must be going on inside that circular wall. Well, of course, if you had migration of hundreds of thousands of festival goers to Shiloh to worship at the tabernacle, you would need space. And dwelling places filling up the city would just be an encumbrance to the worship and to the gathering. Very closely related to the fact that there are no dwelling places, there were no discernible roads. We can't find roads on that hill. And so, of course, that's related to perhaps being no houses. But again, we see a walled compound, but it is not to protect a population that lives within it. So the area of Shiloh was preserved for some purpose other than occupancy. Now you have to come up with what must it mean? What can it mean? Of course, the Bible offers an explanation. And what we find in the ground and what we don't find in the ground, what we find missing, is consistent with that story. And lastly, sometimes the historical story offers only subtle testimony in terms of archaeological evidence. You know, we did find a destruction layer, and the destruction layer happens at the right time for both the Philistine battle at Ebenezer and for the moving of the tabernacle away from Shiloh, showing up in Nob. Now, we don't know exactly when that happens, but we know that David, before he's king, is in Nob, and so is the tabernacle. It's no longer in Shiloh. That doesn't give us a precise date, but it fits the story. There are symbols of worship that we found. We found the pomegranate. We found the horn of an altar. We found a chalice or a kobat, a sacred ritual chalice, not shown here in this presentation. There was lots of centralized storage for grain. You saw the wall where there was storage. So if you have a city and lots of people are living elsewhere and they're farmers, they're storing the grain in their own silos, in their own storage areas. But here, all around the city, we have storage. Why? Because the priests all lived around this city, Shiloh, and the grain offerings that people brought, or the animals that were cooked, and well, the grain offerings in particular, and the fruits, they go into these storage areas because the priests are living communally, not distributed on farms, or at least that's a hypothesis. And only kosher bones with butcher marks and predominant on the right side. We see these things. This is what the archaeology is pointing to us. It tells us that a Hebrew, a non-Canaanite people, had a heightened level of religious practice at this location. And while we might not be able to guess that there was a tabernacle, we might not be able to guess from this that there was an Ark of the Covenant there. This is what the archaeology tells us. The archaeology tells us that the biblical story has a lot of pointers of veracity that we find in the ground. Well, that is our story today as we visited the town of Shiloh, mostly interested in the conquest period and in the period of Judges, but even into the very early as part of the Jewish monarchy. Next week, I haven't picked out a topic yet, but I will still be with you next Wednesday, making another post. And I hope this day finds you well. I wish you the very best, and may our gracious Lord bless and keep you until we meet again. Until next time, be in the Word and be encouraged. Amen and amen.